Welcome to Good News for Ma. This is the podcast that looks at the big questions of the universe and of our hearts. And we're delighted to have Ryan Mays with us today. Ryan is a student of philosophy, studied philosophy at Queen's University, then went to University of Oxford and studied philosophical theology, which he then taught for a year in school. And then he is now back again at the University of Birmingham, and he is studying a PhD in philosophy. Ryan, you must love philosophy.
Yeah, super interested in philosophy. That's my key interest. Yeah.
Good man. Good man. Well, listen, it's lovely to have you on. Ryan, tell us a wee bit about yourself. Are you married? Where are you living at the moment? What's your hobbies? Tell us a wee bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm married. I have a wife for 4 years now. From Northern Ireland. I was born in a little town just outside the city of Armagh. Hobby-wise, like to go to the gym. It's kind of the only thing I do really in my free time now is like just go to the gym. Kind of started that when I was at Queen's University because it was easier just time-wise to manage things, to manage it with my studies. You just go to the gym whenever you wanted to. So that's the main thing I do outside of that. I used to do judo for a while as well, but yeah.
Did you?
Yeah. I got pretty far in judo. I got to like brown belt. I never got my black belt, so I should definitely go back and try.
Very good. That's something you want. That's something you want. Black belt and judo. Brilliant. So you obviously like to read. What kind of books are you reading at the moment?
Well, I suppose the main book I'm reading at the moment is Anselm's Proslogion, which is the book that really contains the original ontological argument. That's really the basis of my thesis. So it's the main thing that I'm reading at the moment. Also, I'm reading a book by my supervisor. Well, I've actually read it. I'm rereading it. A book called Maximal God by my supervisor at Birmingham, and his name is Professor Eugen Nagasawa. He does an excellent job articulating a new defense of the modal ontological argument, which we might talk about a little bit later.
Okay. Very good. So just for everybody else who hasn't really studied much of philosophy, tell me a bit about what philosophy is and why we need it. I'm thinking just recently some of the things that I've read, some of the things that have been stated. So Professor Hawkins famously saying philosophy is dead, difference between evidence and all that kind of stuff. So tell me a wee bit about what philosophy is and why do we actually need philosophy?
Right. Well, philosophy literally just means the love of wisdom. It comes from the Greek word philos, which means love, and the other Greek word sophia, was love of wisdom. And broadly speaking, there are like three main areas of philosophy, three main disciplines. So the first one is metaphysics, second is epistemology, and the third is axiology. So we can talk about a little bit about each one of those. Metaphysics, first of all, probably the most difficult one to describe, but it's what we call the study of being qua being. And that sounds really complicated, but I can break it down and make it a bit simpler. Okay. So that word qua, it just means like considered all. So all subjects study being. Being is just like existing things, right? That's what I mean when I say being. I don't mean like intelligent being. I don't mean like an alien or something like that, right? I mean just something that bees, something that exists. So like a chair is a being, and a table is a being. So for example, biology then studies being, but it studies being, it studies existing things from the perspective of them being a living thing. So it's going to study things like animals and the heart and the lungs and all that kind of stuff, right? Does that make sense? Chemistry then, it's going to study being qua chemical. So like all the different chemical reactions that go on between things, right? That's the way chemistry is studying being. And physics being qua physical interactions and stuff. But metaphysics, it studies being qua being. So what does that mean? Well, it means it studies existing things from the perspective of, or in virtue of them being just existing things. So like what do all existing things have in common? And that's what metaphysics studies.
Okay.
So what do all existing things have in common? What do you think?
What do all existing things have in
Yeah.
common?
What do numbers have in common with tables, have in common with horses, have in common with human beings, have in common with God?
This is where I'm a bad philosopher now. What do they have in common? Particles? I don't know. Do they have that in common? So you're not thinking that's physics? That's probably physics level, is it?
That would be physics, yeah, because we don't want to say like numbers are made of particles, for example.
So so then you would start to kind of, is like metaphysics then kind of grouping beings together. So like humans would have consciousness in common, whereas tables wouldn't.
In a way, that is the kind of a part of metaphysics, but it's not metaphysics itself. So if we say, what do all existing things have in common?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That they exist.
Is that they exist, right? So that's the key thing. That's the key thing that metaphysics is studying is traditionally how it was thought of anyway. I mean, nowadays the boundaries of metaphysics have become very blurred, and so the only way you can really know what metaphysics is now is to kind of look at what metaphysicians look at what they're studying, and if it doesn't overlap with anything else, then that's kind of metaphysics. Okay. So, for example, a big area of metaphysics would be the study of time. But we mightn't want to say that everything exists in time, right? Because we might say that God exists outside of time.
Okay.
Or we might say that numbers exist outside of time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And yet that's still an area in today's day and age, that's an area that would be considered to be metaphysics. So it's kind of difficult to express exactly what metaphysics is, but that's the gist.
So studying of existence. Okay. Dead on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And the ontological argument, it's going to be all metaphysics, which we'll come to.
Right. Okay. Well, okay. So I get where you're going. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So the next one, epistemology. Well, what is that? Well, epistemology is the study of knowledge and truth. So it asks, Pilate's famous question to Jesus, right? What is truth? That's kind of the basis of epistemology. And we're trying to find out also what knowledge is as well. There's all these different theories and ideas about what knowledge is and how do we know things. That's the study of epistemology.
So that's where all the are we in the matrix questions comes.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Are we in the matrix, or are you just in a dream? Are you being deceived by some kind of evil demon? Okay. Well, how do you know? How do you know? So that's the kind of questions that it's really annoying area of philosophy. It's like, how do you know? How do you know? It's like a child asking a parent over and over and over again. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Not really. It's a great area too. Axiology then, that's the study of value. So that's where like your ethics is going to come in. So like, what does it mean for something to be good? Or what does it mean for something to be evil? But also in axiology is aesthetics. So things like, what does it mean for something to be beautiful? All these questions of value is in the discipline of axiology.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So those are the three main areas of philosophy.
So the ontological argument, as you said, that'll be basis around metaphysics.
That'll be a metaphysical argument for the existence of God. Yeah.
Okay. So, so if I was to say to you then, why do we need philosophy? Why is philosophy important to us? Could we do without philosophy?
I don't think we can do without philosophy, because I don't think you can really operate without some kind of philosophy. I think we all kind of have a worldview, whether you like it or not. You have some idea of the world, and you act on that. So, for example, if you believe that there really is an external world out there in front of you, and you're going to act on that, well, that's a kind of philosophy that you have. You may not have thought about it very much, but nevertheless, it's still some beliefs that you hold about the world, and that would come into philosophy. But the other thing is, why do we need philosophy? Well, it answers those questions. It's the only subject that attempts to answer those questions that we just asked. So like, what is truth? What is good? And those questions are really, really important. I mean, philosophy is often ridiculed for being a very impractical subject. And in a sense, it can be quite an impractical subject. I get it. I understand where they're coming from when they say that. But in another sense, it's a very practical subject. In fact, in another sense, it's the most practical subject. because it asks questions like, well, what ought I do with my life, right? And your answer to that is probably going to be it's going to be a philosophical answer. And I can't think of anything more practical than that question, the answer to that question. What should I do with my life? Or does God exist? Like, your answer to that question is going to determine greatly how you choose to live your life. Yeah. So in that sense, philosophy is incredibly practical, and there's also like an intrinsic value to knowing truth and searching out. I think human beings are naturally curious beings that want to try and answer these kinds of questions. So in that sense, philosophy is incredibly valuable as well.
Absolutely. And there are certain questions that we have that cannot be answered empirically. That can't be answered by science. So the why questions. So the illustration of a guy driving down the street with a car, and the guy sitting beside him says, "Tell me about that light." And the guy starts talking to them about resistors and transistors and the different length waves that give green and amber and red. But then the second question is, why is that light there? And the science can't answer that, but it's there for safety, it's there. So whenever you see the red light, you stop. Whenever you see the green light, you go. And there's a massive difference between the why and the how questions of life. And philosophy comes in where I suppose the science can't answer those basic questions. Now, I'm a dad, and so I got 2 wee girls, and the big questions I get asked are, why, mummy? Why? Well, not me. Why, daddy? Why, daddy? Is what I'm asked all the time. And it does seem like what you're getting at there, like it does seem the why questions to us are so much more intuitive rather than the how. Not that we don't ask the how or pursue the how, but they're deeper or something in us. And they come a wee bit easier to, like, my wee girls are 6 and 5, and they seem to just come a wee bit easier or something. And that's why we need philosophy, as well. So,
definitely, I think you're absolutely right. You can't. There are some questions that just can't be answered empirically, and some of those we've already talked about, like what is the good, for example. Like, how do we know what's good? Like, you can't really put goodness in a test. You can measure it.
Yeah,
that's a question that's going to be left for
absolutely
philosophy. Yeah.
So, do you believe that philosophy then can get you to God?
It depends what you mean. If you mean that, can you prove that God exists through reason alone? Then I would say yes. I think you can. And that's exactly what the ontological argument purports to do. Prove that God exists through reason alone. So I think you can do that. But if you mean something like, can philosophy give you an understanding of God and his like complete essence, then no, I don't think philosophy could ever get you that far, because I think God is something that is greater than can be thought, something that's greater than we can ever think of. So in that sense, philosophy is never going to get us like a complete understanding of God in his entirety. But philosophy can give you a deeper understanding of the nature of God, which can give you a deeper appreciation for who God is.
Yeah.
And in that sense, philosophy is maybe getting you closer to God in that sense. But then again, it doesn't necessarily help you build a stronger relationship with God. It's not like all these philosophers have these great relationships with God, because, like, in fact, on the contrary, there's a danger there in doing philosophy as well, because when studying philosophy, there's a tendency to treat God as merely like an object of intellectual inquiry and nothing more.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then you're obviously not building a stronger relationship with God. So I think it's important, especially in philosophy, that you maintain your relationship with God through prayer and daily meditation as well on the scriptures. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Well, that's a good kind of introduction to Philosophy 101 there. Now, so the ontological argument, tell us a wee bit about what it is, and even about some of its origins, if you can, please, Ryan. The ontological argument.
Sure. So there isn't one ontological argument, right? The ontological argument is actually a family of arguments. There's lots of different types of ontological arguments. And my research focuses on a specific one, really, the first one, but we can get to that in just a minute. What unites all these different types of ontological arguments, right? What separates them from other arguments for the existence of God, like the design argument, for example, or the cosmological argument, that's like the argument from a first cause, is that ontological arguments tend to be a priori. So what that means is they don't start with some empirical observation of the world. They start from pure reason.
Okay.
So every other argument for the existence of God starts with observation. So the design argument or the teleological argument, you go out into the world and you see how beautifully the world is designed, or how fantastically amazing the world is designed, and you say something like, well, there's no way that could have got there by chance. There has to be some kind of designer behind that. But it started with that observation of the world as being incredibly designed. The cosmological argument, you go out and you observe the world and you see how causes have effects, and then you eventually trace that back and you say, well, if this cause had this effect and this cause here must have had an effect, and you go and you trace it back to the start. You said there must be some kind of first cause, some cause that started off or knocked down the chain of dominoes that eventually led to the final domino falling over. So again, you're starting off with some kind of empirical observation of the world there. But the ontological argument doesn't do that. The ontological argument, you could, suppose you were born into a sensory deprivation tank, and you lived your whole life in a sensory deprivation tank, so you didn't see anything, hear anything, smell anything. You could still come up with the ontological argument. That's the idea behind it, right? It's just about thinking. You can just think about it, and you can prove that God exists. Because the way that you're trying to do it is you're going to reason from some aspect of God's essence or God's nature, and you're going to reason from that to his existence. And normally you do that through something like perfection. You say that God is the most perfect being, but existence is a perfection. So if God is the most perfect being and existence is a perfection, then God must have existence, and so God must exist. Now that's a very, very that's kind of a Cartesian ontological argument I've presented there, which is not the one that I'm studying. But that's a very kind of simplified version of the ontological argument. Is that the idea of how it works? That's
close to that's Amson's argument there, is it?
That is René Descartes' ontological argument, which came after Anselm's. Anselm's was the first, and that's the one that I'm researching and looking at, that I want to talk about as well.
So it starts, you might say it starts in the mind.
Exactly, yeah. It's a good way to put it.
With who we think. And it is like so in reading about this a wee bit, it seems that most philosophers well, not most philosophers, but a lot of philosophers will say this is a good argument. But the average punter, the average John on the street kind of goes, hold on, well, what about if you just sat in the room and thought up a unicorn? The ultimate unicorn, or I saw that the great pizza is a big thing on. So is there danger in that, of starting with the mind or intuition, or?
Right. The first thing I might want to say is that I don't think even most philosophers think this is a good argument. I mean,
let's stop the podcast. Let's go.
I mean, there's a lot of theistic philosophers who think it's a very good argument. I suppose if you took philosophers in general, including all the atheistic philosophers, they're not going to think it's a very good argument. But then they don't think any argument for the existence of God is a good argument. So.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, there's this worry that the ontological argument, when you look at it for the first time, it appears like a kind of like a word game or just some kind of logic puzzle, something like that to work out, but it doesn't really prove anything, right? It's just throwing words together and seeing what comes out.
Sure.
And I think that's a natural intuition for people to have, because normally we can't prove that something exists just by thinking about its essence.
Yeah.
Right. If I think about the essence of a table, for example, I can't prove there's nothing in the table itself that means that the table has to exist,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or there's nothing in the chair that means that the chair has to exist. That just in thinking about what a table is, or just in thinking about what a chair is, I could possibly prove that it exists.
Mm-hmm.
That's because that tables and chairs, they are contingent things.
Yes.
They are things that can cease to exist. That's what I mean by contingent. They are things that could go out of existence, that came into existence and go out of existence.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the intuition becomes stronger in favor of the ontological argument whenever you begin to consider something that exists necessarily, or something that exists, that has to exist, something that couldn't fail to exist. And if you think of it like that, then you might wonder, well, why does this necessary thing exist? What is it about this thing that makes it have to exist, whereas everything else, tables and chairs and trees and everything else, can fail to exist? Well, it can't depend on something outside of itself for its existence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if it depended on something outside of itself, that thing that it depended on would have to be something that either exists necessarily or exists contingently.
Yeah.
But if it exists contingently, then it could fail to exist. And so the very thing that the necessary thing is depending on for its existence could fail to exist. So the necessary thing could fail to exist, which means it wouldn't really be necessary.
Yeah.
So it can't depend on a contingent thing for its existence. So it would have to depend on some other necessary thing, which just pushes the problem back.
So it's not like, it's not sitting in a room and thinking of just anything. And this is what I was kind of coming down on.
Yeah.
So like, because like unicorns and pizzas and all that kind of stuff, they're contingent and all that. So it's like the kind of phrase that I wrote down was that it's intuitive logic. So that there is something intuitive to us, that we're not reaching for a pizza or a unicorn, but it seems because we are made in the image of God that we are aware of God. And there's an intuitiveness that that God is there, but also there's logic there, that it has to work. So it has to be a necessary being, like of what you're talking about there, that it can't be contingent. Would that be fair enough?
Okay, just say that first bit again. What was the first bit you said?
It has to be like, the phrase that I wrote down was, it has to be intuitive logic. So like, because I'm a convinced Christian, and this argument for me works within the framework of Christianity, because each person has that intuitive knowledge that there is a God, made in the image of God. But then the second idea is, go on ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say, I don't think this argument is going to work for anything else other than God. I don't think it works for unicorns or pizzas or anything like that. And I don't think it's just a matter of it kind of being more intuitive for God or something along those lines. I think it's actually just going to flat out fail for a unicorn. It's just, the unicorn is just not the kind of thing that can be a necessary thing. It's going to fail logically. I don't think this is an argument just for Christians either. I think this is an argument that you could use to persuade an atheist. Now, maybe the ontological argument is not the most persuasive argument taken at first. I think whenever you look into it deeper, and as you said before, a lot of philosophers, not most of them, but a lot of them, do find it compelling. Yeah. And for that reason, then I think it's the deeper you look at the ontological argument, the more persuasive and powerful it becomes whenever you begin to understand how it actually works.
Yeah, I think there is a persuasiveness with it. I think people just get uncomfortable because it starts in us, and I think that's where the uncomfortableness, because if it starts in us, then whatever we imagine, then that's what people think, you know. So we're thinking of this necessary being. It needs to be a necessary being, but people are thinking, well, you could think of anything, you know, if it starts in you.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to get to that. That's something I really want to talk about as well.
Yeah, brilliant.
The parody, these are called parody objections. Whenever you try to replace God with something else, like a unicorn or a pizza or an island, these are called parody objections. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. In fact, that has actually been the main topic of my research. Is this parody objection. So we can talk about that definitely.
So I think that's helpful to realize that there's a variety of ontological arguments, and it has developed from Anselm to Descartes, and I think most recently Plantinga. He's
Plantinga, yeah.
So, so do you want to what tell us what you're focusing on, or what ontological kind of argument do you kind of think works?
Okay, I think the original. I like Anselm's version the most. Yeah, okay. A lot of people don't really like Anselm's version; they don't think it works anymore. But I think, again, the closer you look at it, the better it looks. Yeah. He was the one who originated the ontological argument, and his is kind of a conceptual ontological argument. Then you have Descartes, who developed his own ontological argument, and you had Spinoza, you had Leibniz, Gödel also endorsed the ontological argument. Then more recently, you have the modal ontological argument, which is a different kind of ontological argument. The word modal there means it relates to possibility and necessity. So Anselm's argument is not really going to talk about possibility and necessity. We'll see it in a minute. But the modal ontological argument talks about necessity, and it was developed by main thinkers, Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga, the scholar that you just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And then you have some contemporary defenders as well. Alvin Plantinga is a contemporary defender, but also you have my supervisor at Oxford, Brian Lefto. He is a defender. He's a defender of the ontological argument. And you also have Eugen Nagasawa, my supervisor at Birmingham, and many others as well. For example, Joshua Rasmussen is another one who is defending the ontological argument recently too. And he just recently put up a video on YouTube. I think he was presenting at the Capturing Christianity conference, and he's put up a video on YouTube explaining his new formulation of an ontological argument, which is really interesting. You can watch that on YouTube. But yeah, so do you just want to get stuck in and just take a look at the ontological argument?
Yep. you walk us through it.
Okay. I wonder, can I share my screen?
I'm not sure.
That's all right. I can read it out. I can just read it out. All right. So the ontological argument begins by describing God as something than which nothing greater can be thought. So God is the greatest thing you can think of, right? Mm-hmm. If you thought of something greater than God, then that thing would be God, right? Mm-hmm. You can't think of anything greater than God. So God must be something than which nothing greater can be thought.
So by definition, this is who God is. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, although I don't want to say by definition, but this is certainly a description of God's essence, which is very close to a definition. So we can, for now, we can say it.
So earlier on, their chat about being, like this is God's being. He is greatest. Would that be fair enough?
Yes, this is his essence. This is what it means to be God.
He is the greatest.
Part of what it means to be God is that God is something which nothing greater can be thought. Okay. So premise one of the argument that goes like this. So God exists in the mind alone, or in the understanding alone. So that's what we're going to assume, right? We're assuming this for what we call reductio. We're going to show that this is actually not true, that God cannot exist in the mind alone. He must exist in the mind and in reality. Okay. So we're going to assume this, and we're going to show that it entails an absurdity. And if we show that this entails an absurdity, then we know that it must be false, that God does not exist in the mind alone, and therefore he must exist in the mind and reality.
Okay. So
that's the way the argument is going to work. This form of an argument is called a reductio ad absurdum.
Okay.
Because we're reducing the argument to, or reducing the first premise to absurdity. Okay, so that's premise one. Premise two, if God exists in the mind alone, then I can think of God as existing in reality, right? So just like the way I can think of Bilbo Baggins, right? I can think of Bilbo Baggins. And I can think of him in Middle-earth in his hobbit hole, having a cup of tea with the dwarves and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But I can also think of Bilbo Baggins just like over there in that chair in my room. Like I can think of him in that chair, right? So I can think of Bilbo Baggins in the mind, but I can also think of him in reality. So in the same way, we can think of God like as being just like a thing in the mind, just like a concept in the mind or something like that. But we can also think of him as existing in reality. right? If he exists in the mind alone, then we can think of him as existing in reality.
Okay. Is that the difference between thinking and imagination?
I suppose you could, these are fairly interchangeable. You could say, I can think of it this way, or I can imagine it to be this way.
Okay.
That's okay. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Premise 3 of the argument then says this: if I can think of God as existing in actuality, then I can think of something greater than God, because it is greater to exist in the mind and in actuality than in the mind alone. Okay, why is it greater to exist in actuality and the mind alone? Well, because things that exist in the mind only have one degree of being, right? They exist in only one way. They exist only in the mind.
Okay.
But things that exist in reality as well have a greater degree of existence. Okay, so Anselm is presupposing that there are degrees of existence. Some philosophers don't like this, but I think this makes a lot of sense. And there are some good motivations for believing that there are degrees of being, but we don't have to get into that. That'll just complicate things too much. But we can say that if you exist in the mind alone, you have less existence than something that exists in the mind and in reality. So in that sense, if I can think of God as existing in the mind and reality, then I think of something that has greater existence than God. I think of something that is greater than God in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Does that make sense? But then if I can think of something greater than God, that's a contradiction, because God is something than which nothing greater can be thought. It's a contradiction to think of something greater than something than which nothing greater can be thought.
Sure.
So we've entailed an absurdity from the first premise, which means that the first premise must be false, right? Well, I mean, it could be the case that one of these other premises are false that but let's assume those are true for the minute.
Okay.
And we can say it is not the case that God exists in the mind alone, but if it's not the case that God exists in the mind alone, then God must exist in the mind and reality. Have you frozen? I think we've stopped our internet unstable.
It's frozen a wee bit. Are you frozen or? Yeah, you're back.
I think it's okay now. Yeah.
Do you want to repeat that last?
Okay, so so we've entailed an absurdity from the first premise, which means that it can't be the case that God exists in the mind alone. But if it's not the case that God exists in the mind alone, then he must exist in the mind and reality. And if he exists in the mind and reality, conclusion, he must exist in reality or in actuality. And then I was going to ask, well, what do you think about that?
That's a lot. But the basic premise is that we as humans can think of this great being both in the mind and in actuality. So he must exist.
Because he is something than which nothing greater can be thought, because that is what it means to be God. We can't just think of anything like a pizza or something like that, and just because we can think of it in reality, it has to exist in reality. That's not what's going on there.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on is that we're saying that God is something that which we can't think of anything greater than God.
Yeah.
But wait a minute. If God existed only in the mind, then I could think of something greater than God, because I could think of God as existing in reality as well. But that's a contradiction, because you can't think of something greater than God.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, God can't just exist in the mind. He must exist in reality. Therefore, he exists in reality.
So that's why it's okay that the argument exists or starts in the mind, because it's about our capacity to think of nothing greater than God.
It starts in the mind because the idea behind the ontological argument is that you can just prove that God exists from his very essence. You don't need to go out and do some empirical observation of the world to show that God is there. You just need to think about the kind of thing that God is, and God has to exist because God is this kind of thing, because God is like a necessary thing, because he's an essential thing. He is something that has to exist in the world. That's why the ontological argument is only going to work for like necessary beings, and it's not going to work for contingent things like tables and chairs and so on.
Okay.
Does that kind of make sense?
No, that does. Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful. And I suppose that everyone listening, like whenever we do think about great things in our mind, you can't get past God. You can't think your way past God's greatness because that's infinite. You can't think your way past God's wisdom because that's infinite. You can't think your way past God's power or benevolence or his holiness, like, because that's infinite. You can't think your way past it. And so that is that what you're getting at? Yeah.
Whenever I say that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought, I do mean that God is something that has the greatest amount of whatever it is greater to be. He has the greatest amount of it possible. So if we say, for example, that being wise is a great making property. So it's the more wise you are, the greater you are, right?
Yeah.
Then God must have the most amount of knowledge or most amount of wisdom possible because he's the greatest thing.
Yeah.
And you can't think of anything with more wisdom than the thing that has the most amount of wisdom or all wisdom,
yeah.
right? So for example, we could say that omniscient because he knows all true propositions. He knows all of them to be true. But you can't know any more true propositions than knowing all true propositions.
Yeah.
Right? So you can't think of anything that knows more than God because God knows everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that would apply for all of God's great making properties.
Okay.
So like power and goodness and all those kinds of things as well.
Okay.
So that's what we mean when we say that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought. You cannot think of anything greater than God. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, what are the main objections then?
The main objection, I suppose, is the one that you've raised already, which is the parity objection, which came originally from a contemporary of Anselm, and his name was Gonilo, and he was a monk like Anselm. He was a Christian just like Anselm, but he thought that this argument didn't work because he thought that, well, it proves too much, right? If we accept this ontological argument, then we can accept that it proves anything. Pizzas, lions, greatest mountains, greatest pizzas, greatest lions, greatest islands. His example was that of an island, right? So he's going to parody the argument, which means he's going to just take the same structure, the same form of the argument, and he's just going to replace God with what he calls the lost island. And he calls it a lost island because it's this like greatest island that we've never found, right? He says this, he says the lost island is an island than which no island greater can be thought. Okay, so he's going to define it in much the same way as Anselm defines God or describes God. So then premise one, the lost island exists in the mind alone. Let's assume that for reductio. Premise two, if the lost island exists in the mind alone, then I can think of the lost island as existing in actuality.
Yeah.
But if I can think of the lost island as existing in actuality, then I can think of an island greater than the lost island, right? Because I can think of the lost island as existing in the understanding and actuality, which would be a greater island. Therefore, I can think of an island greater than the lost island. But that's absurd. That's a nonsense. That's just a contradiction because it's impossible to think of an island greater than an island than which no island greater can be thought, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So then you get the same conclusion as before. You say it's not the case that the lost island exists in the mind alone. Therefore, the lost island exists in the mind and in reality, and therefore the lost island exists in reality. So he's going to say, look, Anselm, nice try, but if we accept your line of reasoning, then we can prove literally anything. We can prove the greatest island, we can prove the greatest pizza, we can prove the greatest lion, whatever. You name it. Right. So how do we deal with this objection? Well, first of all, what do you think about that? Do you think that's a good objection, or do you think that there's something off about it? Just like your intuition.
No, well, I get the whole difference between an island and God. Like I get that between necessity and contingent and that. But it takes a bit of work to get there. And I'm thinking about the average John on the street, you know. So you tell them this argument and that it is what they will think it's and I actually had a chat with a guy the other day because I told him we were going to do this podcast and his ontological argument, and he was like, but that means that you could think of anything. And that was his first gut.
That is the gut reaction, isn't it?
That is the gut reaction. So why Wait, well, you answer the objection. Why, if I'm chatting you on the street and you've just explained this to me, and I say, well, why can't I just imagine the island? What would you say?
It is kind of funny thinking about standing in the street trying to explain the
I
ontological
know.
argument.
You need a whiteboard.
Yeah, you do kind of need a whiteboard. I don't know if this is really a street apologetics style argument. Maybe not.
But I think that's why. I think that's why, because people want a nice, quick, pat answer.
Yeah.
And for a lot of the deeper things in life, you can't give a pat answer. You have to sit down and think and work it out. And I think that it shows us maybe something about where we're at. Maybe, I don't know. But anyway, so if you were to give the answer, what would you?
Okay, so there are two common replies to the island parody. Mm-hmm. The first is to say, look, the notion of a greatest conceivable island is just incoherent, right? Like, think about it for a minute. What would make an island greater? Like, what do you think? What do you think would make an island greater? What would make one island greater than another island? What do you think?
Well, I'm thinking of Hawaii at the moment, so okay. So beaches, sun, skies, waterfalls, Fanta orange on tap. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's take that. That's really good. So, like waterfalls. Let's take waterfalls for example, right? Okay, so if waterfalls make islands greater, right? And you could add a waterfall to an island and make that island greater by adding a waterfall to it. But then you could add another waterfall to that island and make it greater again. Mm-hmm. Then you could add another waterfall to that island and make it a greater island again. So the idea here is there could always be one more waterfall, right? Mm-hmm. I could always think of an island with one more waterfall.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is if I can think of an island with always one more waterfall, then I can always think of a greater island. There is no greatest island, just an infinite chain of greater and greater islands, but there's no greatest island. Yeah. So the notion of a greatest conceivable island or an island in which no greater island can be thought is just incoherent. But does that apply for God as well? Well, this is Plantinga's objection that I'm presenting here. Mm-hmm. And Plantinga says, no, this doesn't apply to God as well. God's great-making properties, says Plantinga, have intrinsic maxima. Well, what does that mean? It means that they have a limit. They don't go on forever, like the way waterfalls go on forever. So we've already talked about knowledge, right? Once you know everything, there's nothing more to know.
Yeah.
Right? There's not always one more thing to know. It's not like I can always think of one more, like a being that knows one more thing than God, mm-hmm. because once you know everything, that's it. Mm-hmm. The same goes for like power, right? Let's say great power is a great making property, right? Then you're greater, the more powerful you are. So the more, like, the higher you can jump or something like this, and the further you can run. But wait a minute. Once you're able to do everything, there's nothing more that can be done.
Yeah.
Right? And if God can do everything, then there is a limit to that great making property, right? Everything. Once you can do everything, there's a limit. So God's properties don't go on forever like the way the island's properties do. There can always be another waterfall. There can always be another coconut. There can always be another palm tree. But there can't always be another power. There can't always be another piece of knowledge, right? And in that way, God, the idea of a being in which nothing greater can be thought, is coherent. It's logical, it's reasonable, but the idea of an island is incoherent. And the idea then is, no matter what you apply it to, whether it be pizzas or lions or mountains or whatever else,
so because God is the only
complete,
God is the only complete, perfect being in the universe, so vis-a-vis, it only works for him.
Yeah, basically, a more precise way to put it would be say that God's great making properties have intrinsic maxima, but the great making properties of anything else do not have intrinsic maxima. They don't have limits.
So intrinsic maxima, that's a fancy way of saying greatest.
Limits. Yeah, limits. It has like a limit to how great it can be.
Yeah.
It doesn't go on forever.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That's helpful.
So that's Plantinga's objection. I think that's an interesting objection. I actually have some problems with that objection, but I'm not saying that it doesn't work at all, but there's some interesting things that you can maybe pull apart in that objection. But there's another objection, which I'm more keen on. And it says this, right? It says that Garnilo's parody doesn't really parallel Anselm's argument, right? So the idea behind Garnilo's parody is that, look, here's your argument, Anselm, right, for God. Now I can create like a parallel argument. I can create an argument that's the same as your argument and prove that an island exists. But the idea is they have to be parallel. They have to be the same kind of argument. If they're not the same kind of argument, then there could be something wrong with this argument that isn't wrong with that argument, right? There could be something wrong with the parody that isn't wrong with Anselm's argument.
Yeah.
So does Garnilo's parody really parallel Anselm's argument? Well, the answer to that question is no. It doesn't parallel Anselm's argument because the size of the scope size of what it's dealing with is narrower. And what I mean by that is Anselm's argument is only dealing with the set of all possible islands, whereas Anselm's argument is dealing with the set of all possible things. Now, the set of all possible islands is just a subset of the set of all possible things. So what that means, it's just like a set within that set, right? The set of all possible things includes the set of all possible islands. And in that way, Garnilo's parody does not parallel Anselm's argument at all. And if it doesn't parallel Anselm's argument, then you can't say that it really refutes the argument. Mm-hmm. Now, that's where I come in and I start taking up my own research at this point, and I've really expanded on this quite a bit. I think to go into everything that I say on it would maybe might be a bit too much. We can if you want to, but
well, give us the, if you can, give us like the nuts and bolts of what do you think? If we can, like, if you've a fuller explanation, we can put links to it in the description below. I
can try and express it as succinctly as I possibly can. The idea behind my reply is that, well, there's something special about the set of all things that doesn't apply to the set of all islands. And
right, whenever you talk about the set of all things and the set of all islands, basically what you're saying there is that, well, actually define that again. Just to...
Sure. So this set of all things is just like a grouping of everything you can think of, right? So the set of all things is going to include elements such as tables, chairs, laptops, you, me, everything you can think of.
Everything in the world, yeah, okay.
Everything in existence goes into that set.
Sure.
Whereas the set of all islands, well, only islands.
That's what Amson was doing. Amson was saying that out of everything, God is the greatest. But what that other dude was doing was just limiting his islands.
Exactly right. So Anselm's working within that set of all things. He's saying the greatest thing, right? The greatest thing in the set of all things. Mm-hmm. Whereas Garnilo is saying the greatest island in the set of all islands, which is a much smaller set.
With you.
So what I go on to say then is like, well, there's something special about this greater set doesn't apply to this smaller set. And what would that be? Well, so Garnilo's parody says that it's possible to think of the lost island as existing in reality, right? So I can think of the lost island as existing in reality. That's one of the premises in Garnilo's argument. But to think of the island as existing in reality, I have to think of it as either existing in reality accidentally or essentially, right? So what do these two terms mean? If you have a property accidentally, it means that you could lose that property and still be the thing that you are. So for example, I have black hair, but I could lose the property of black hair. One day my hair will go gray or it'll all fall out. I could lose that property, but I'd still be Ryan, right? I'd still be me.
Sure.
That's an accidental property. it's not accidental in the sense that like it's a mistake or something like that. It's accidental as in like it could change.
Sure.
It's not essential to who you are. Essential properties, on the other hand, are properties that you couldn't go without, right? And still be the thing that you are. So, for example, I am essentially a human, right? If I ceased to be a human and started being a rock, well, it just wouldn't be me, right? I couldn't be a rock. Ryan, there's no possible world in which Ryan is a rock. Mm-hmm. Ryan has to be a human. My humanness is essential to who I am. So that's an essential property of me. And my hair being black, or the height that I am, or the color of my eyes, whatever, those are all accidental properties of me. Those could all change and I could still be Ryan. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's the difference between essential and accidental properties. Now, when I think of this island as existing in reality, then I can think of it as existing in reality accidentally or essentially. So I can think of it as existing in reality as something that could fail to exist in reality, that is accidentally, right? Am I still making sense? Are you still following?
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Or I could think of it as existing in essentially, or existing in reality essentially. I argue that neither of those two things is actually possible. You can't think of it in either way. Why not? Well, you can't think of it as existing in reality accidentally, because if I thought of it as existing in reality accidentally, right, then I could think of the island as not existing in reality, because it's only an accidental property of the thing.
Sure.
Just in the same way I can think of Ryan as being bald, so I can think of myself as being bald, right? In the same way, if the island existed in reality only accidentally, I could think of it as not existing in reality.
Yeah.
But if I could think of it as not existing in reality, right, then I could think of an island greater than that island, namely an island that does exist in reality.
Yeah.
Right? So either I could think of it as existing in reality, or maybe I could think of something like Ireland, because Ireland does exist in reality and it's an island. Mm-hmm. I could think of that, and that would be a greater island than that island. But this is supposed to be the greatest island. So that would be a contradiction. Yeah. That would be a contradiction again. So you can't think of the greatest island, the island in which no island greater can be thought, as existing in reality accidentally. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well then, why can't I think of it as existing in reality essentially? The problem here is, if you add existence in reality to the essence of being an island, right, then it's going to cease to be an island, because you've changed its very essence.
Yeah.
Right? Like in the same way, if you change my essence, I'm going to cease to be Ryan. I'm my essence. Ryan is Ryan's essence. So if you change my essence, I'm going to cease to be Ryan. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, if you change the island's essence, you're going to stop thinking of an island. You're going to be thinking about something else, something that's not an island. Yeah. But wait a minute. If I'm thinking of something that's not an island, then I'm not thinking of an island than which no greater island can be thought.
Yeah.
Right?
With you.
I'm thinking of something else that's greater than that island.
That works, yeah. And
so for that reason, then I can't think of the island as existing in reality essentially either. So I can't think of it as existing in reality in either way. Mm-hmm. So I just can't think of it as existing in reality, which means that Ganilo's parity is going to fail. That premise of Ganilo's parity is false.
So it doesn't work.
Right. That's a lot of information, but does that kind of make sense?
I thought it does. So
okay, great.
The island analogy fails for two reasons, probably different extremes. Because if the island, then my language to make the island godlike in a sense will actually change the nature of the island.
Yeah,
and it'll no longer be an island, or else as an island it stands, it can always be added to, and so it doesn't have the godlike qualities, basically. Exactly.
But here comes the really amazing part, right? The really fascinating part is that, okay, I can think of God, right? Does this argument that I've just presented, does that apply to God as well? And it doesn't. I mean, I can't think of God as existing in reality accidentally for the same reason as the island, because then I could think of something greater than God. Mm-hmm. So I can't think of God as existing in reality accidentally. But I can think of him as existing in reality essentially. Why? Because whenever I add existence in reality to the essence of God, right, I think of a new thing. and here's the kicker, it's still a thing, right? So whenever I added existence and reality to the essence of the island, I thought of a new thing, and this new thing was not an island. But whenever I add existence and reality to the essence of God, I think of a new thing, and it's still a thing. And that's why it's important that we work within the set of all things, because I think of a greater thing than God. And so we still get the contradiction. And so for that reason, then, I can add existence and reality to the essence of God, and the argument can still work. But it only works for God. It doesn't work for islands. It'll only work for the set of all things. It won't work for any smaller subset. And that's my research so far into that area. And obviously, there's a lot more that I could say, but that's
genuinely helpful. And it all seems, it is all based, like, so the way we started this was actually very helpful in terms of like metaphysics dealing with being and essence. And it all, like, the argument is a lot about who God is, and to properly get an idea of God's greatness and who he is essential for the argument. And so that's why nothing else can work. That's why nothing else contingent, because you need to add to it or you change the nature of it. It won't work. It only works for God himself. That's right. Yeah. Cool beans.
So for that reason, I think it's the most fascinating argument for the existence of God. For me, it's the strongest argument for the existence of God. But I understand also why, for your buddy on the street, it's going to be not really persuasive, because first of all, it's dealing with stuff in the mind, as you've said, which is not the most intuitive notion. There's a lot of explaining. There's a lot of background information that's really necessary to understand this argument in its completeness. So it's not something that you can do street apologetics wise. Far better would be something like the design argument, or even William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. Would be far better for like a kind of street level apologetics, because it's simpler to explain. Yeah.
And also, like, I think that the big difficulty in probably getting that argument across is actually getting across who God is. Because I think that would be not like the big definition of getting across to people who he is. And because I think if you get that idea of God being the greatest, then that it does actually add a lot of power and weight, because the argument can't work for anything else other than God.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's interesting as well. Very good. That's helpful in understand. So that's a powerful argument, I think, for God. Is that the only reason why you believe in God?
No, it's not the only reason I believe in God. I think there are other good reasons to believe in God. Some of those other arguments I've mentioned as well. I think the cosmological argument and different variations of the cosmological argument are good arguments for the existence of God as well. But I think the real thrust of your question there is not like, well, are there other good arguments for the existence of God? It's like, does your belief in God depend entirely on like having reasons and logic and so on for believing in God? Is that all it depends on, or is there something more than that? And there is something more than that for me. I don't believe in God just because I think there are good reasons to believe in God, and I do think there are good reasons to believe in God. But it's not just that. It's not just for those reasons that I believe in God. I also have a hope that there's something more to this life than just matter in motion. I have a hope that there's some objective purpose and meaning to all of this, that there's some objective source of goodness out there in the world, that in the end, perfect justice is going to be done for everyone, and everyone will get what they justly deserve. I have a hope that is true. And it's not just like a vain hope. It's not just like a kind of, oh, well, that would be nice if that was the case, and I'm not going to do anything about it. It's what I say is it's like an actionable hope. It's a hope that I'm going to live my life by. I'm going to live my life by that hope, and trust in God that this is actually the case. Because what's the alternative? The alternative is something like something like despair and nihilism, where there is no objective meaning in life, there is no goodness at bottom. It's just matter and motion things. There is no goodness to it all at the end, and there will be no justice. Justice will be evil people will get away with their evil things, and good people will not be rewarded justly for what they've done. And for that reason, I also have this hope that then there is something more to this life than that. And that's another reason why I do believe in God. But I want to emphasize, and I was thinking this the whole time I was saying that, and this is not just like merely wishful thinking, right? This is not just like me saying, okay, it would be nice if this was the case, so I'm going to believe it and act on it. It's like, it's not that, because I also do think there are good reasons for believing in God. And so in that sense, I think being a theist is rational. But it's not just those reasons that I believe in God. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I was recently watching The Lord of the Rings for like the millionth time. Have you seen the Lord of the Rings movies?
Oh, absolutely. I remember actually being in the cinema and watching the first one. I didn't know it was a trilogy, so I was actually annoyed. But what happened in the cinema was about 3 people to the left. There was a wee bit of ruckus halfway through the movie, and or actually, about 15 minutes into the movie, and we looked over, and this girl was being sick all over the place. She's being sick all over the place, and the smell of it was just awful. But I'm tight, and so we paid for our tickets. So me and Johnny, we weren't going, and we bore with the Fellowship of the Rings, literally holding our nose at some points. It was stinking. It was
maybe added to the atmosphere whenever they enter the mines of Moria.
It was awful. Anyway, sorry. Yes.
Anyway, I was going to give you an example from Lord of the Rings of a good example of faith. So you might remember from the third movie. It's only in the extended version, but mind you, but that's the only way to watch Lord of the Rings anyway. But in the extended version, in the third, the end, right? So spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen it. Aragorn has just reclaimed the throne, and he is approaching the Black Gate of Mordor. And the gates open, and out comes a servant of Sauron, the mouth of Sauron on his horse. And he stands before Aragorn and says, "Look, we have captured Frodo." And he shows Aragorn the mithril vest, the unique mithril vest that only Frodo has ever had, right? And the idea of a hobbit being able to enter Mordor and get to the volcano and throw the ring into the volcano was so absurd anyway. I mean, the chances of this happening, right, was so slim. And now you've got evidence saying that Frodo's dead and that the ring is in the hands of the enemy, and Sauron now has the ring, and that the world is going to fall into darkness because Sauron's going to rise up with this ring and conquer the world again, right? But how does Aragorn react in this situation, right? You look around his friends, you see Gandalf and you see Sam, and well, you don't see Sam, you see Pippin, Merry and Pippin and the other people who are with Aragorn. You see them despairing, you see them giving up hope. Right, they've encountered some evidence here that suggests to them that there's no more hope left, and they give up their hope. But what does Aragorn do? Aragorn doesn't. He says, "I do not believe it. I will not. I do not believe it. I will not." And we don't go to Aragorn here and say, "Well, Aragorn, you're really not following the evidence where it leads. You should follow the evidence. The chances of Frodo getting through Mordor was so slim. He's got the mithril vest. If you were to weigh up the evidence here, Aragorn, come on, you should really believe that Sauron has the ring and the world's going to be destroyed now." But he doesn't believe that, and we don't blame him for believing that. In fact, we do the exact opposite. We praise him for not giving in to despair. We praise him for the hope that he has. There's something virtuous about Aragorn's character that he doesn't give up hope in this situation, even in spite of the evidence. So I'm not saying that we're in the same epistemic predicament as Aragorn was. I think we have good evidence to believe in God.
Yeah.
But also, if the options are between nihilism and theism, that there is some meaning to all of this and utter despair, the right thing to do, the praiseworthy thing to do, the good thing to do in this situation is to not give up hope and to continue hoping that there is a God and live like there is a God. And so for that reason, I also believe in God, and I act on that hope and my desire that there is a God.
Yeah. Yeah, like I would fit this ontological argument into the kind of collective argument. Like, so you've mentioned loads of them there. Just from all like philosophy, like first cause earlier on, argument from design, morality, you mentioned there with justice, like meaning, purpose, hope, like all of those things are massively intuitive, and this ontological argument for me slots in to all of that collective argument that there is for God, not to mention like God breaking into this world, and in Jesus Christ, him coming historically into this world. And like, so for me as a Christian, like for me, God is the best explanation for all of these things, for all of the collective things, not to mention that aspect of Jesus coming into this world, standing in front of Pilate, as you said earlier on. And I think he actually says, for this reason came I into this world, that I may bear witness to the truth. And this is Jesus Christ, the ultimate, the ultimate evidence to us of God. But the ontological argument fits in to that so well, because it defines, it helps us, because like the God of the ontological argument is the God who makes the most sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an excellent point you make. I think there's this kind of cumulative case that you can make for God and makes God more reasonable to believe in. One thing I do want to just say, though, is that I understand why you'd say the ontological argument fits into this this cumulative case for God, but there's actually something a bit unique and special about the ontological argument. It's not like these other arguments.
Okay.
All these other arguments kind of give like an accumulative, like evidential case for the existence of God. Well, not all of them, but most of them do. For the example, the design argument says, well, look how well the world is designed. It must have a designer. But that's kind of like giving kind of evidence to suggest that there might be a designer. But the ontological argument is special because it's an a priori argument, because it's from reason alone. And the truths of the ontological argument, if the premises of the ontological argument, if they are true, are necessarily true, the ontological argument is like a standalone argument for the existence of God. If the ontological argument is sound, if you believe that it is sound, it alone should be enough to prove that God exists. You actually don't need a cumulative case if you think the ontological argument is sound. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't also have this cumulative case. Like, you definitely, there's no problem with having that. But Anselm's point in the Proslogion is to have what he calls an unum argumentum for the existence of God. That is one single argument for the existence of God that proves him that we don't need any other arguments. So that is that's very unique and special about the ontological argument as well, which is very interesting. It's a very interesting entailment of the ontological argument. So I just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. It is helpful. But I was just thinking in terms of like the cumulative in terms of like every sphere of study. So like you've got evidence from history, the coming of Jesus. You've got evidence from physics and cosmology. You've got evidence from mathematics. You've got evidence from philosophy. You've got evidence from intuition. You've got evidence from mind. Like everything in this universe is geared toward pushing us toward God. And we know it. And like the reason why I would add the ontological argument in, because it's another level. It is different. And it starts in the mind. I don't think there's an argument like that. And so like that adds another level of communication for me. So that's brilliant.
Good.
Well, bro, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate that. It was very helpful. I'm gonna go and lie down for a while and relax my mind. But I don't think it will be, because my mind's kind of racing now. But that was very helpful in helping us to understand the ontological argument. So thank you so much for coming on today, and thank you so much for listening. And if you do want any other information or any other help, please do contact us. There will be more podcasts coming on the horizon. We have a podcast on history by Professor Gribben from Queen's. That's on the horizon, and Hugh Ross as well, astrophysicist, is coming on in a while, and Professor Fink from Germany is coming on to talk about science and religion. So do look out for them. They'll be coming up in the next few weeks and months. So thank you for listening, and goodbye for now.